Alright, chapter 18 of Hidden Figures. This is called With All Deliberate Speed. In 1958, Katherine Gobble and her research group took on what seemed like the world's most interesting challenge, sending a human being into space. NASA reorganized the research team, so they were doing all they could to turn space flight from a comic book fantasy into reality. The Space Task Group, set up to be the nerve center of the new operation, was made up of many engineers and female computers from Katherine's group, the Flight Research Division, and the PARD, the Rockets Specialists. The new group decided that their space mission needed to be an appropriate name, so they decided to call the effort Project Mercury, named for the god of travelers in the Roman mythology. The space program brought a lot of attention to Hampton, Virginia. Unfortunately, even as the engineers and mathematicians at Langley embraced the future, the state seemed stuck in the past, unwilling to let go of its segregational policies. Virginia's legacy as the birthplace of humanity's first step into the heavens would have to compete with its embarrassing reputation as the country's most outspoken opponent to the integration of public schools. So that means that right now they still had their public schools separated where blacks and whites couldn't go to the same school. Virginia schools were in chaos. Some schools had tried to comply with the Supreme Court decision requiring states to integrate their schools with all deliberate speed. The governor refused to allow integration, so he ordered that the doors to those schools be chained shut. 13,000 students found themselves sitting at home in the fall of 1958. Black and white families struggled to send their children to private schools or move their school-age children to live with relatives in other areas so they could get an education. In 1959, Virginia's government finally reopened most of the schools in the state, but the administrations in Prince Edward County, which included Farmville and Dorothy Von Hahn's former high school, R.R. Monton, chose to defund the school system rather than integrate. They just stopped giving the school the money they needed to stay open. The Prince Edward schools remained closed from 1959 through 1964. So that is 5 years that these schools were closed, that these kids could not go to school. So if you think about what we're going through right now, this has only been a month or more. This is 5 years that these kids couldn't go to school. In other parts of the state, including those in Hampton Roads area, the schools remain open but segregated, despite the Brown versus Board of Education decision making segregation illegal. In the fall of 1958, the children of the Langley black and white employees returned to their separate routines at their separate schools. Katherine Gobble didn't have energy to spend fighting with the local school system. She didn't approve of segregation, but she wanted her children to get a good education. She continued to push her children to excel in segregated schools. She was still trying to balance the demands of still being a single mother and working at a demanding job. She still lived with the grief of having lost her husband years before, but she didn't let that side of her show in public. Between work life and home life, Katherine regularly attended worship service and sang in the church choir. One evening in 1958, a handsome 33-year-old Army captain named James Johnson came to choir practice at Katherine's church. He had grown up in Hampton and trained in the aviation metal smithing. During World War II, he became an expert in the aircraft maintenance and repair. After completing his service, he landed a clerk job at the Commerce Department in Washington, D.C. He also signed up for the U.S. Navy. For the U.S. Navy Reserve, repairing planes for test flight. He loved planes just as much as Katherine did. Katherine hadn't intended to fall in love, but she and Jim began dating. Jim's devotion to the military made it easy for him to understand Katherine's commitment to her work at Langley. He was also sensitive to the secretive nature of her work and the long hours it demanded. During these intense period of competitions with the Russians, people at Langley often worked until 10 p.m. or later. The Mercury mission. Katherine worked long hours on her new assignment involving Project Mercury. In less urgent time, the researchers at NASA might have followed a slower or more sympathetic approach to their work, conducting careful and measured investigations of all possible options in space travel. With the Russians off to what looked like a commanding lead, NASA sought the simplest, fastest, and most reliable way to get into space. The engineers approached Project Mercury by breaking it down into different parts. One team looked at the space of the aircraft determining that it should be streamlined to minimize aerodynamic drag. Another team of researchers showed that a needle-shaped structure would most effectively deflect the extreme heat caused when the aircraft zoomed through the atmosphere. They recommended a blunt-based body, something shaped like a cork, which would create a shock wave as it came back to Earth, minimizing the extreme heat and keeping the person inside safe. The spacecraft would have to be small, so astronauts could be no taller than 5 feet and 11 inches, had to weigh less than 180 pounds. Each astronaut candidate was required to be a qualified test pilot younger than 40 years old with at least a bachelor's degree. After months of searching, NASA selected the final crew. In 1959, NASA held a press conference to present the Mercury 7 astronauts to the world. Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, Gordon Cooper, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, and Scott Carpenter. There was a great deal of preparation done by everyone, from the researchers to the astronauts, before takeoff of the spacecraft. NASA assigned the astronauts to an office on the Langley campus next door to the Space Task Group. Langley employees loved catching a glimpse of the astronauts, who had become celebrities, walking around the campus. The Mercury 7 trained hard, both physically and in the classroom, preparing their bodies and minds for the unpredictable journey ahead of them. While the astronauts were preparing for this important mission, Katherine Gobble had to calculate the flight trajectories. In other words, she had to plan the exact path that the spacecraft would travel across Earth's surface from the moment it lifted off the pad and flew through the atmosphere and into the space, until it splashed back down in the Atlantic Ocean. Project Mercury required so much work that the Space Task Group, which coordinated all aspects of the space mission, relied on other divisions at Langley and at other NASA centers to help carry out their task. Day after day, the team pored over equations, scrawled ideas on the blackboard, evaluated each other's work, erased, and started over. Catherine's new job, analyzing, involved the study of the projectile moved through the space, both here and on Earth and in outer space. This work was similar to that done by other female computers who spent thousands upon thousands of women hours computing mathematical tables, which soldiers used to figure out how to fire their weapons and hit their targets. The Space Task Group decided that the best way to send the first person into space, was a simple fight. The capsule would be fired into space like a bullet from a gun or a tennis ball from a ball machine. This first spacecraft would not have any guide of its own. The capsule would go up and then come down and land in the Atlantic Ocean. Where the capsule landed depended on where it was launched. The calculations had to be exact so the astronauts would return close enough to be waiting with the U.S. ships to quickly hoist out of the water and pulled to safety. Katherine understood that carrying out the orbital mission would be more difficult than this simple fight. The team would have to plan the journey so prestiged that the spacecraft would pass through the atmosphere, hurtle along on a looping circle around the planet, and land exactly in the right place. "Let me do it," Katherine said to her boss, working as a computer, or a math aide. Katherine had proven herself. She was older than many of the engineers she worked with, but she matched them at every turn for intelligence, enthusiasm, and work stamina. "Tell me where you want the man to land, and I'll tell you where to send him." Katherine knew the math as well as anyone else. An engineer named Ted Spasnik was assigned the task of preparing the research report, and as his computer, Katherine assisted him. He thought she was smart and he respected her work, so he gave her an opportunity to take on a challenging assignment. She had to consider factors that were unique to orbital flight. For example, she needed to take into account the fact that Earth isn't a perfect sphere, but a little bit squat, like a mandarin orange. She also had to factor in the speed of Earth's rotation. Everything had to be spelled out and identified. Over the months of 1959, a 34-page research paper began to take shape. It was remarkably complex, filled with equations, charts, and tables of calculations. "Katherine should finish the report," said Ted. the engineer she had been collaborating with. "She's done most of the work anyways." Catherine's boss Henry had a reputation for being less than supportive of the advancement of female employees, but Ted encouraged her to put the finishing touches on her report. Her boss gave in after Ted made the case for her. The report was titled "Determination of Azimuth Angle at Burnout for Replacing a Satellite Over a Selected Earth Position." After 10 months of editorial meetings, analysis, recommendations, and revisions, the report was published in September 1960. It was the first time a woman working in the Aerospace Mechanics Division had managed to get her name on a research report. For Catherine, the completion of the report marked the new beginning of a new phase of her life, not just as Langley, but at home too. Somehow, during the long days of 1959, she accepted an offer even more exciting than being invited to the editorial meetings at work. Jim Johnson asked her to marry him. The couple wed in August of 1959, when she put her name on the final draft of her first research report, she signed her new name, Catherine G. Johnson. So the first woman and African-American woman to get to sign their name and take credit for their work. Why do you think that's important? What do you think it shows the rest of the world?